Well, hey there, everybody. Sorry, it took me a minute to get everything set up there. Just a second here. I like ODST Labs, but sometimes I like Steam Labs, but sometimes you've got to like set things up a little weird to get them to work. Hey, Brandon. Thanks for coming on, guys. We'll get to some reading here in a bit, I reckon. I'm just gonna wait for some people to sign on. See who makes it. I am pretty well on time tonight, so I'm not quite as late as usual. Am I coming through okay? Can you guys hear me all right? Mic levels look pretty good, so. Might turn it down just a little so I don't blow anybody's speakers out. Yeah, there we go. That's not too bad. Okay. How's your Saturday going? You guys doing all right? Hanging in there? Still trying to figure out what we should read tonight. If you guys have got any suggestions, I've got all my books. So, normal, you do not need those books. Somebody had to come check out my setup over here. You are too jingle jangly. Gonna take that. Sorry, I'm not as prepared as I should be here. Post a link to this in a couple of places. I think by now I'd figure out how lives work. Ooh, good luck with that, man. Master's degree, that's huge. Dang. Congrats, man. I hope it goes well for you. Let's see here. Well, let's see. Let's go ahead and get started, I reckon. Anybody got any suggestions on stories? Like I said, I've got all my books, so we can read anything. There you go. Sometimes you just gotta Sometimes you just gotta put it in the universe's hands there, man. Just do what you can. Let's see. I don't know what to read here. What should we read? What do we got here? I put the dedication page with all my Patreons in here, but I didn't put a table of contents. Oh. With all Halloween stories. You know what? I'm going to tell you what we'll do. We will... Excuse me. You know what? I've got a book coming out at the end of the month, actually. You guys want to read some excerpts from the new book? It's Towsey Homestead. I mean, you guys have heard it before, but give you guys a little sneak peek. Some of my favorites? Well, I like any of the Killian stories. The Killian stories are always usually a big hit with me. That's a tough one. I like the grandpa stuff, of course. The grandpa stuff is usually some of my favorite stuff. Yeah, any of the any of the Kashmir stuff is usually a big hit with me too. I like the little town of Kashmir that I've built and all the stories that I've got around it. It's a lot of fun. But yeah, no, I like all my stories, I guess. I mean, I did write them, so I might be a little biased, but put this up in the community tab. Maybe people will come and have a look-see. Yeah, let's just get you guys a little sneak peek of what to expect with the Towsey stuff. I'm sure you guys would be all about that. It's coming out probably the end of July would be my guess. End of July, early part of August. Hey, Sue. Glad you could make it. New book, Towsey Homestead, probably coming out end of July, beginning part of August. I've got it ready. I'm trying to figure out when the best time to put it out would be. It'll, of course, if you're on the Patreon tier where you get books, that'll be probably your second book this year. So I think it's like $10 a month for the book tier, which ain't bad. I mean, I usually write 1 to 2 books a year, so after the first, it pretty much pays for itself. Let's see. Let me grab that, and we will get rolling. I was gonna get it. We'll hit it about 8:10, I guess. That way, give some people some time to come on down. I see the viewers count going up. So. Excuse me. Before any of you ask, no, this is not Dr. Plague merch. I bought this on Temu because I liked how it looked. It's not the size I ordered. It's actually a size too small, but I think it's kind of cool. It came in today, so I figured I'd wear it for the stream. Thought it would look cool. Let's see. All right, well, let's get rolling. For those of you who haven't heard it before, Towsey Homestead was our Halloween story a few years ago. It's kind of fall Halloween adjacent. Like it involves the Towsey farm and the events that go along around there. And yeah, let's read a little Towsey Homestead. How about it? If it gets boring, you guys just let me know, and we'll swap over to something else. I mean, we've got a lot of options there. All right. The corn moved leisurely in the afternoon breeze. Samantha, Sam to her friends, shivered in her short sleeves, and as she and Paul plucked the corn from the tall, proud stalks. It was nearly Halloween, and Sam was sure that she could feel a strange sort of magic in the air. Halloween had always been her favorite time of year when she lived in New Hampshire. From the windows in the living room, a much younger Sam could watch the other children in their witch and ghost costumes, the boys in their plastic masks and the girls in their silky princess hats, as they walked up and down the street in their eternal search for candy. Not like she was ever allowed to join them. The thought of Miss Beverly Weston, the head of the Society for Christian Morality, letting her little Samantha out dressed as a devil and bother the neighbors for candy was unthinkable. Yeah, that is right. You want to go out there on Satan's Day? Sure, why not? I suppose you want some sex pervert to snatch you off the street, or some doped-up satanic cult to grab you. Your chocolate and confections will make you feel better while they're carving out your heart and screaming. Hang on. Confections will make you feel better while they're carving out your heart and screaming, "Hail Satan," at the top of their lungs. Sam furrowed her brows as she thought about it. Everything had always been like that with her mother. No Santa Claus on Christmas, since that was how the atheists muddled up the religious holiday. No Easter Bunny on Easter, because that was how the pagans took the spotlight away from Christ. Valentine's Day, 4th of July, even Groundhog's Day were all some kind of affront to her mother and her nearly fanatical religious creed. Halloween, however, was the worst of them all. Little Samantha had to be content with sitting and watching from the window as the parade of brightly colored costumes marched by. Paul bumped her with his hip, taking her out of her memories as he passed by. "What's got you so bummed, Sammykins? You look like some square just stepped on your skirt hem." She laughed and threw an ear of corn at him. "You're going to catch pneumonia if you don't put on a shirt, Paul." He caught the corn and shrugged. "I'm a California boy, babe. The sun is in my veins." Paul had the box balanced on his hip like some native woman in a National Geographic magazine. If ever there had been a boy that Beverly Weston would have approved of for her dear Samantha, Paul was the exact opposite. He wore a leather vest with beadwork on the front, and usually left his chest bare to the world. Paul claimed that a Navajo medicine man had given it to him after he sat in on their drum circle in Arizona, but Crystal had whispered to her one night that she knew he had bought it from a roadside stand in New Mexico. He paired it with the same pair of ratty acid-wash jeans and the heavy-looking sandals he loved so much. His toes were also on display for the world, the better to let his hobbit toes breathe, he often said. It was too early to think about these sorts of things, but Sam found that she loved him, despite herself. She had met him in a bookstore, reading fantasy novels in the attached coffee shop. He was reading the kind of books she knew her mother would burn on sight, and he was getting some looks as he balanced his bare feet on the table. She had looked up guiltily when Paul caught her reading Lord of the Rings and engaged her on the subject of how hobbits were the best representation of hippie culture. Both loved to live simply. They lived with nature, existing in a state of ease, not to mention smoking a lot of pipe weed from time to time. In his case, it smelled like real weed hanging around him in an acrid cloud. She had pointed that out. Unlike your average child of the movement, hobbits were not prone to adventures, and hippies were basically nomads, from what she had understood. He had laughed and said that he supposed that she had him there. A month later, they had snuck out of her parents' house, and now she was living with Paul, Crystal, and Jesse as they rode around the country in Jesse's love bus. "Careful," said a spattery voice, and Sam nearly dropped the box of corn that she had filled as she spun to look behind her. The farmer, Mr. Towsey, had come from nowhere to stand beside her. They had been here for almost a month, and Sam wasn't used to how he could appear and disappear at will. He was a slight man, maybe 5'2", with an odd corpsey look. When they'd first met him, she thought he might be sick. However, a month of working with him had shown her how wrong she was. He was eerily fast, moving through the crops like a mole, and his energy seemed limitless. He would pack and store with the best of them until sunset, and often sat up late with them as they told tales of the world. He didn't seem to eat, seeming to take their tales in like manna. He had confided in them that he had never left the farm for more than a few days, only going to town to sell his crops and get supplies. Sam supposed she could understand that. After all, Towsey Homestead sat on a small island that bore its name. Hello, everyone. If you're just joining us, we're getting a little sneak peek of Towsey Homestead, which is my book coming out probably the first bit of August. So pack in. We're just getting started. They had met Mr. Towsey at the local fill-in gas station during one of their stops, and the meeting had been opportune indeed. Paul didn't like to call what they did begging. We're just making do with what the universe provides. Paul could call it what he liked, but Sam knew begging when she saw it. Who should know better than a girl who had stood on the corner with her can and begged for charitable donations throughout her childhood? Paul had his guitar out, Jesse his drum, and Crystal swayed to the music as Sam banged her tambourine in time. If growing up in the church had prepared her for anything, it was tambourine banging. They were working on a small pile of bills and a ball cap when Paul saw the manager talking animatedly into the phone. The guy was working on a pretty high widow's peak, and his hand gestures seemed to be saved specifically for them. Whoever he was on the phone with was telling him what he wanted to hear, and when he hung up the phone, he glared at them with the biggest shit-eating grin Sam had ever seen. Paul decided it might be time to go, and the quartet started wrapping up their operation. When the 5-spot fell into the hat, Sam looked up to the man and jumped a little, the corpsey fellow having come out of nowhere. "Pretty," he commented, as Paul thanked him, "but I think you'd better pack it in." Paul cocked an eye at him, his song dying out as Jesse continued to smack his drum. "Yeah? You the law around here, man?" "No, but I'd say that Sheriff Danfield will be here any minute. You certainly wouldn't be the first group of travelers he's thrown in the hoosgow, their money gone and their vehicle impounded." Paul nodded, catching on and thanking him for his charity. "I wonder if maybe the four of you would mind helping me with something." Paul seemed to think it over. Maybe. What you need, man?" It's the time of the year when I find myself looking for farm hands. If the four of you agree to help me this month, I'll pay you $200 and let you stay on my farm. Room and board and compensation. You'd be hard-pressed to find a better deal than that. If you're just joining us, we're reading Towsey Homestead. So have a seat, have a listen. I think you'll like it. Paul pretended to think about it, but Sam knew that look. Paul wasn't the kind of guy to take on real work. He would sit out and play his guitar, beg for change, and once he returned with some clothes that she suspected he and Jesse had stolen off a wash line. He would beg and steal, but ask him to work an honest day's work, and that was his limit. Sam loved Paul, but she was beginning to wonder how this relationship would last. Paul chose to live in the moment, but despite her best efforts, Sam seemed to struggle with living that way. Paul had just opened his mouth to tell the farmer no thanks when a blue and white Caprice pulled up into the gas station parking lot. It circled the lot slowly, the officer the officer's reflective shades already seeing his target. Hang on. Slouching is no good for reading, apparently. All right. It circled the lot slowly, the officer's reflective shades already seeing his targets. He pulled around the back of the fill-in, and Sam was certain that he would come sliding back around again any minute. Watching him circle like a buzzard had Paul reconsidering the man's offer. He finally agreed, saying he needed some gas first, or they might not make it more than a few miles. When the farmer reached into the back and took out a can of gas, Paul smiled and started pouring it into his tank. Jesse and Crystal put their stuff back in the van as quickly as possible and piled in after it. "Better hurry," the farmer said, showing them a mouthful of grayish teeth. "Sheriff Danfield doesn't take kindly to panhandlers." They were back on the road and following the farmer's old Ford truck a few minutes later. The officer had watched them go from inside the fill-in as the manager pointed at their retreating plume of dust. They didn't have a long drive. The fill-in was on what was conceivably the edge of town. The town wasn't huge. It had a main street, a shared elementary, middle, and high school, a handful of businesses, and a beach around a large lake. They had passed it as they came into town, and it was hard not to notice. Sam had squinted at the small island that sat in the middle. It was buried in the fog and hardly visible, but Sam could just make it out as the bus rolled over the bulge. Give me 2 shakes. That's the best thing about reading these out loud, is sometimes you see the little mistakes you might have missed before. It had drawn her attention with its It had drawn her attention with its mystery, and Sam had hoped they would find out more about it. As they pulled up at the dock, seeing the boat Mr. Towsey had anchored there, Sam thought she might get closer to the mysterious place than she had ever anticipated. That had been a month ago, a month of working the field and helping Mr. Towsey transport crops to the mainland in his boat. He had shown them the pontoon boat he had brought, easily big enough to fit 10 people, and the motor on the back made their progress easy. He had handed them duck-yellow rain slickers, but only Sam had seemed to take the warning to heart. It was sunny on the dock, and Paul snorted at the thought of a little water putting him out of sorts. The closer they got to the island, though, the thicker the rain became. By the time they had docked, everyone but the farmer and Samantha was soaked to the bone. "The island has a strange weather pattern about it. You get used to it after a while," Mr. Towsey had said. And so they did. It seemed to rain almost all the time, the wind pushing it against them as they picked the crops. Sam had gone to sleep every night with the sound of rain in her ears, and Crystal snoring as she slept beside her. Mr. Towsey had been clear that girls would stay in one room, and boys in the other, and they had really been too tired to argue with him most nights. They worked all day in the misting rain and the scattered sunshine, and slept like the dead at night. Until tomorrow, that was. This would be their last night on the island, and tomorrow they would all leave $200 richer. The van was being watched by the people who maintained the dock, and Paul and Jesse had been going back to check on the vehicle every few days. They would have enough gas in their tank to get to California, which was good enough for Sam. She wanted to see this land of sun that Paul and Jesse kept talking about. She wanted to see the sparkling beaches her mother scoffed at in the magazines at the grocery store, and feel the pure West Coast sun on her skin. As she loaded the last box into the barn, she looked back at the now picked field behind them. She had little doubt that next year's rows would be filled again with corn and beans and squash, but it seemed that this year's harvest was at an end. Paul scrubbed a hand across his brow and looked out at the field as well, putting an arm around her before kissing her on the cheek. Makes you want to never leave, huh? He whispered. Sam shrugged. I don't know. It's peaceful, but I thought you said you weren't the putting down roots type. Paul winked. Maybe someday. Maybe someday. We all have to stop running sometime, I suppose. He kissed her cheek, and the two of them walked back towards the house. Tomorrow was going to be a long one, and they needed to sleep. Tomorrow, Sam would be seeing places she had never seen before. Alrighty, that's part one. That's the first part. The book's in a few different parts, but that's the first chapter of the first part. You guys liking it so far? We can swap it up if you're not, but just let me know. Also, don't be afraid to put your questions up there. I don't mind answering questions, and we can take breaks in between. Hey, Leslie. John, good to see you, man. Oh, that's, if any of you guys are just joining us, that's Towsey Homestead. That's going to be my book coming out in a couple of weeks, probably first part of August. About first part of August. It's kind of an autumny book, so I figure, August around in there would be a good time to put it out. Longtime listeners of the show will remember it. It was our Halloween story a few years ago. Well, thank you, Brandon. It's one of my favorites. You would ask me about my favorites. I really like Towsey Homestead. It's the first real book I've ever written. I've written short story compilations before, but this was the first one that really feels like a book, First one that feels real, It's I like it. It's a interesting choice of words there considering the subject material, but the inclination is there. Well, if you guys like it, let's move on, I reckon. Again, if you've got any questions about stories or anything you want to ask, just go ahead and put it in the comments. And in between chapters, I'll take a stop and answer some stuff, and just kind of hang out. This is you guys' live stream, so we will definitely hang out. That one's going to be a fun book too, John. I'm working on that one as we speak. But I'm trying to get the Dollar General stuff done first. Excuse how crispy my voice is, guys. I'm struggling with allergies pretty hard over here. So I'm a little verklempt there. But yeah, Maneater is coming along nicely, and I think it's going to be a fun book too. But I'd really like to get the Dollar General book out first. I think I'm about 65 to 75% of the way done with it, but I think it's going to be done very soon. Alrighty. Chapter 2. Sam and Crystal had made them a hearty stew for dinner as the boys sat on the porch, smoking with the old farmer. He sat in his rocker and puffed on a large pipe, smiling with the boys as dinner bubbled away. The old house reminded Sam of her grandparents' house. The dusty old furniture, the lack of television in place of a sagging bookcase, the smell of pipe smoke and old dust were all comfortable aromas that made her nostalgic. Sam always felt a little contemplative when she sat on the couch after a long day's work. The boys were smoking something Mr. Towsey didn't want them to light up in the house, and they had to contend with sitting in the wide front porch and watching the corn husks scamper across the now barren fields. As their laughter became more raucous, she heard him come back inside. She looked out at the now barren land as she chopped carrots and potatoes for the pot. The whole thing had been picked in just 29 days. It had been unthinkable when they had seen it. Farmer Towsey had acres of farmland, beans and squash, and a rippling sea of corn. They had worked them from dawn till dusk most days, breaking for a lunch of cold sandwiches and crispy ears of corn. The corn was raw, but none of them minded. The corn here possessed a sweetness that none of them had ever tasted before, and they were all ravenous for it when it came time for lunch. Paul had joked that they would probably eat rocks after the work they had done all day, and said that this was easily the hardest he had ever worked in his life. There were 8 ears of corn cooking in the oven now, along with fresh bread and sweet potatoes. Along with the beef and vegetable stew that was cooking, it would make quite a hearty meal. Sam tipped the vegetables into the pot as the broth boiled and bubbled. It smelled amazing, and her stomach gurgled hungrily. Crystal closed her eyes as she sniffed at the stew, sighing happily. This is just what the doctor ordered after a long day in the fields. She looked into the oven, smiling as the loaves of bread browned and the buttery exterior of the sweet potatoes began to crack, displaying their glittering treats. Call the boys and tell them it's ready. We cooked the grub so they can set the table. Sam walked through the living room, seeing the old man slumped in his chair. Just the top of his head was visible over the back of the chair, his salt and pepper hair looking oddly delicate in the setting sun. She suspected that he might be dozing, and decided to let him sleep. He had worked just as hard as any of them, and it seemed that it had taken a toll on him. Paul and Jessie were on the front porch, smoking and watching the sunset. Plumes of marijuana smoke wafted over their heads, making them look... Plumes of marijuana smoke wafted about their heads, looking like crowns as they laughed into the face of the setting sun, and they sounded merry as lords. Sam put her hands on her hips, Paul laughing and saying she looked like his mom in that apron as he tried to pull her in for a kiss. Sam made to turn her face away, but giggled as his lips brushed her ear, telling them to get up and set the table. Jessie snorted, telling her to figure it out, but Paul doused his roach and got up to help. Come on, Jess, it's a new world. We should share some of the burden, too. He kissed her again before walking inside, Jessie sighing heavily as he got up, too. They moved into the kitchen to get things set up, Sam walking over to wake up her host and let him know that it was nearly supper time. Paul stuck his head back out of the kitchen before she had taken more than 3 steps. He looks pretty tuckered out. Sure you don't want to just let him sleep? He worked as hard as we did today. He deserves a chance to eat with the rest of us. Paul shrugged and followed Jessie into the kitchen. Sam stepped into the living room to rouse their host, the sound of plates and glasses being taken from the cabinet providing a soft background. The closer she got to the chair, the more aware she became of a soft rasping sound. It slid over her senses, sounding familiar but not entirely comforting. She had heard that sound somewhere before, the soft kiss of metal on leather, but her mind also attributed it to pain. The old man's head was still hunched, making her think he was sleeping, but as she got closer, she could see his shoulder rising and falling as he worked at something. Sam came up next to him, preparing to tell him that dinner was ready, when she caught the sight of what that sound was. He had a leather strap laid across his legs, and was sharpening an interesting silver razor. The leather strap, that was the familiar sound. How often had her mother sharpened such a razor before shaving her legs? How often had she taken that same leather strap and tanned Sam's backside or legs with it? The leather strap was her mother's favorite means of discipline, and Sam remembered how it had felt as it came down across her skin. Her mother had come after her with that strap the day before she had left, sensing a change in her child, but Sam had slammed the door in her face and left in the night like a thief. Seeing that strap made her shudder. Mr. Towsey looked up from his work, seemingly surprised before laying his tool aside on the end table and smiling at her. Sorry, miss, I was lost in the act. The razor was my mother's. She used it in her sewing, and after she passed, I took it to remember her by. Sam smiled at him, praying it didn't look strained. She felt another shudder at the sight of the tool. The blade was crude but sharp, the edge honed over years of such work. The handle, however, was a dirty bone, gray with age. It might be anything, but Sam suspected it was a deer bone. She had seen razors like it, usually passed down through a family line. But the feral nature of it made her a little uneasy. The way he looked at it made it clear how much he cherished it. It should have been sweet, or at least endearing. But as Sam watched him slide the razor against the leather strap, she felt her skin crawl, and a deep longing to be gone washed through her. She left him to his work, as she went to go set the table. She couldn't stand to watch him sharpen that razor for one more minute, though she couldn't have said why. All right, let's check these comments. Oh, yeah, you're right about that, Brandon. I don't know if that's what it is. I'm allergic to most of Florida for some reason. I don't know why. It's kind of a pain, but it is what it is, I guess. Seems like the longer I live here, the worse it gets. But that's what I get for living in a swamp. If you guys are just joining us, this is Towsey Homestead. Book should be coming out about August. Probably like the first couple of weeks of August. I've already got it done. I've just got to put it out at the right time so it sells the best. Let's see. Like I said at the start of the last chapter, if you've got any questions or anything you want to comment on there, go ahead and post it in there, and I'll catch it at the start of the next chapter. Oh, we've got a... What's up, David? With a pig hide? Strip of pig skin. My goodness. Mom was more fond of psychological games, but Dad had hit us with a paddle every now and again. I mean, I think that was about as... I think he probably would have used a belt, but Mom had told him she'd use the belt on him if she caught him doing it. I think Mom grew up getting beaten with belts and things, and it was never something she wanted repeated. Mom just took your stuff away. She's like, what was it Mom always used to say? The sting of getting hit will pass after a while, but the sting of losing your favorite stuff lasts a lot longer. Let's see. All right. Chapter 3. They sat around the table, heads bent as they ate heartily. The day had been long, but now it was over, and the business of eating could begin. Paul and Jesse were talking about some guy they had met in Reno, Card Shark, or some guys they had met in Reno, Card Sharks or something, and Mr. Towsey was listening politely. The girls whispered amongst themselves about the trip tomorrow, excited to get back on the road. California was still a long way away, and Sam was excited about what they might see. Crystal said there was a giant dinosaur along the way that they always stopped at, and since they were getting some cash from this guy, she was sure that Paul would stop in Las Vegas or Reno so they could piss it all away at the tables. As Paul's story petered out, Jesse laughed as he talked about scalping the card sharks and running with the money, but he looked at the farmer. As Paul's story petered out, Jesse laughing as he talked about scalping the card sharks and running off with the money, he looked at the farmer and asked something that he had clearly had on his mind for a while. "So tell us your story, sir," he said, catching Mr. Towsey by surprise. We've regaled you with our stories for the last month, but I don't think we've heard any of yours." Mr. Towsey looked up from his plate, the food there almost untouched, and fixed Paul with a decidedly wolfish grin. "What is it you'd like to know?" he asked, the steam from the hot stew making his face look grim, like an idol peeking from the mists. "Got any good stories about that rock formation in the field?" Jesse asked suddenly. Sam shivered a little as she thought about that strange rock edifice in the cornfield. It was so raw, so pagan, and Sam really didn't like to go near it if she could help it. Sometimes she almost felt like it was watching her. Jesse and Paul, however, had been fascinated by it. When they had discovered it amongst the thick corn stalks, the path around it scorched and barren, they had stopped to stare at it for quite a while. They had asked Mr. Towsey about it several times, but he seemed hesitant to talk about it. He said it was just something in the field, a curiosity for the curious. He said his father hadn't been able to move it. Said his father had been unable to move it, and that he saw no reason to fool with it. It was heavy, made of big rocks that had been quarried roughly, and Sam almost felt like she could smell blood in the barren soil around the thing. Excuse me. That was the other thing that made Sam shudder. The rock formation looked like one of those satanic altars her mother had always talked about. And remembering the vivid details that her mother had likely fashioned from half-truths made her feel funny. They were the superstitions of her past, but it was a life that she had lived until very recently. Mr. Towsey snorted. Visitors always seem interested in those old rocks. You know, it's made of the rocks from the mainland. It was formed when my daddy was still alive. We all lived here on the island, though it wasn't an island back then. This lake used to be trees and forests. My brother and I explored whenever we had a free minute. We fished the streams, hunted for game in the forest, and found more than 2 boys could have explored in 10 lifetimes. Of course, he added, looking away suddenly, that was before the rain came. The rain? Jesse asked, as if they had practiced it. The table had become so quiet that his voice carried even in a low register as he spoke. Oh, yes. One day it just started coming down and never stopped. It washed away the whole town. It covered the forests and the hills, but it spared the farm. We've been an island ever since, and when the town sprouted up about 15 years ago, I was glad for the company. And you were here for that? Jesse asked, looking skeptically. Farmer Towsey nodded. I was. I've lived on this island my entire adult life. That sounds like a hell of a story, Paul said wistfully. Can you tell us about it? The old farmer smiled at his stew. That's a pretty long story. You sure you got time? Paul and Jesse looked at each other, nodding as Jules said, We'll make time for a story like that, man. Sam wasn't sure she wanted to hear it, but she nodded like a puppet with the others. She had been captured by the story, and now she was powerless to ignore it. Mr. Towsey looked up and shrugged. Very well, then. It all started with that pile of rocks. And that'll take us into the first part of the book. Hope you guys are enjoying Towsey Homestead. If you're just joining us, the book comes out in August, so, about a month. I was going to do it at the end of July, but I don't know, this feels like it just feels like a fall kind of book, It was our Halloween story a couple of years ago. About 2, I guess. 2 or 3. The year I started this channel. I did it as the Halloween story that year. So, it's got some history. Alrighty. Like I keep saying, if you got any questions or suggestions or anything, let me know in the comments. I'm just going to keep reading. Brad sat hunkered behind the corn, watching his brother stack the rocks and feeling his back prickle with a sense of foreboding. What the hell was Greg doing? The sight of Greg's arms straining beneath the heavy rocks made his own a little wobbly. The barren circle in the cornfield held 13 of the massive slate stones, 5 stacked in a kind of weird formation, and 8 waiting to be stacked. The rocks were large, unevenly cut, and looked to Brad as though they weighed more than his pigeon-chested little brother. To his astonishment, Greg moved them with no more effort than Brad would a rowdy hen. Excuse me. He had followed him out here on nothing but his curiosity, and had found far more than he had expected. Greg had been acting strangely for the last couple of days. He had been disappearing, abandoning his chores, and Brad believed that he was going to this small stretch of field. It appeared that Greg had been building this edifice over the past few weeks, and Brad couldn't imagine how he had missed it. The structure should have been visible over the corn by now, but it didn't stick out or attract the slightest attention. Brad sucked his teeth, a habit his mother hated, as he tried to remain silent amongst the corn stalks. He felt unwelcome here. This was a new feeling, since Brad had played in these fields his whole life. His father had purchased the farm before he was born, and Brad had been born in November, just as the first harvest had ended. That had been a difficult year. Daddy had always said so. He considered the birth of his first son to be a good omen for things to come, though he hadn't been wrong. Let's see. The farm had been about 75 acres then, and Brad had watched it grow as he did. Now the farm was 200 acres of lush and fertile land. It was good land, and Brad's father knew how to work it so that it might yield what his family needed. The land had fed them, brought them money, and supported them through hard times. It was odd to feel like a stranger in your father's land, but just lately he found that the fields seemed to hate him. It wasn't anything tangible. The ground didn't wither at his touch, but it was something Brad felt more than he saw. He seemed to find his feet tangled in roots more often, the wind blowing stalks in his face when he least expected it, finding the vegetables he pulled to eat bitter more often, and of course the capricious nature of the forest. Brad shuddered at the thought. Brad shuddered as he thought about the forest. Once it had been his sanctuary, his respite from the day-to-day, but now those woods were a source of fear and shame. Fear for what lay within its boundaries, and shame for what truth lay behind him. Daddy wouldn't hear any part of a 15-year-old boy being scared to go into the woods and made him collect firewood once or twice a week. Greg went with him, but he never stayed with him. Greg didn't mind the woods, walking through them the same way Brad had once, and he always managed to slip away from Brad and leave the older boy lost and confused in the green embrace. Brad would gather his wood, his strong arms lifting his pile and heading out again, but the woods always seemed to change behind him. Brad would find himself walking familiar trails, only to end up back where he had begun. This unnerved him because Brad knew what direction home was. He had learned to follow the landmarks inside the green since he was old enough to walk the trails without his father. These days, the woods seemed hostile. As he stumbled and fretted, arms straining with the wood that grew heavier and heavier, he would hear things behind him as they crunched through the undergrowth. These weren't the usual deer or birds that often stumbled along. They were big things, loud things, things that meant to make sure the next time Brad's parents saw him, it was only after the undertaker had made him presentable enough for a casket. The other reason he felt uncomfortable in the field, uncomfortable in the forest, was the most alarming. It was alarming because it made Brad think he might be crazy. When he was in the forest, walking amongst the fields, and sometimes even as he lay in bed, Brad could hear whispers. Brad could hear whispers of something that had no love for him. The pastor had often spoke about the subtle intrusion of Satan. He spoke of that nettling voice that told you to pull a girl's pigtails or to steal from a store. But Brad had never experienced such a voice before. His own inner voice sounded scared, unsure, as it told him that he better return that library book before he got in trouble, when it reminded him that Mama had said no cookies before dinner as he reached for the jar, and when it reminded them that the thought he was having about Melissa Doolin was sinful. Brad was used to this pissy, scared little creature that spoke truth to him, but this new voice was something that he had never heard before. It whispered that he was a coward, a traitor, and he wasn't welcome here. It spoke to him in the voice of the corn, the creak of the barn, the groan of the eaves at night. The words were carried to him by the capricious wind and seemed to tell him that the roots he tripped over, the branches that slapped at him, and the hen that pecked his hand as he reached for the eggs were not random happenstance. They were his due, his punishment, and he should go as Cain had gone before he angered whatever force controlled this place. Greg sat a big rock down. I got that out of order. Like I said, best editing I've ever done is just reading some of this stuff out loud. Greg sat a big rock down, and the sound of it colliding with its smaller cousins made Brad jump. Greg heard the rustle and turned his head, looking back at Brad's hiding spot with mistrust. Brad got low on his stomach against the ground as Greg scanned the rustling corn for intruders. Brad didn't want Greg to know he was spying on him. He didn't want his brother to suspect that he had found a way into his sanctuary, and watched as Greg went about whatever he was doing. Greg stared into the corn for a few more seconds before returning to his building. Someone is up to something in there. Weird noises behind me. Brad sighed quietly. Greg had been so strange lately. The two had been best friends since Greg was old enough to walk. He was only 3 years older than Brad. He was only 3 years younger than Brad, and he was only 3 years younger than Brad, and they had only had each other since Thomas was born. They had grown up as farm kids, attending school only when time allowed, and Brad had always had difficulty making friends with the other students who attended classes with him. Brad was an outlier, most of the other kids coming from town, and they were nearly a different species in Brad's eyes. They had their own jokes, their own circle of friends, and sometimes seemed to have their own language. Brad attended the small high school so long as he wasn't planting or picking the next town over, and many of the kids looked down on the farm kids who they bussed in to attend school. Brad had tried to make friends with some of the other kids, but they were prone to the same stretches of absence that he was. When the crops needed to come in, there was no time to waste with math or geography. Daddy needed Brad and Greg from the front and center to help with crops, and he always came back hopelessly lost in his studies. Hey there, Sasha. It's Towsy Homestead, if you're just joining us. Should be fun. We're reading the book before it comes out in August. Probably not the whole book, it's a biggie, but let's see, where were we? Brad's debilitating shyness didn't help matters much either. Brad was a fearful child, prone to jumping at loud noises and crying rather than fighting. The other kids had picked up on this and labeled him as just another big dumb farm boy. Brad was aware of his size. You didn't buck hay and plant crops your whole life and not put on some muscle, but he was aware of it in a way that made him cautious about his size. He was a mindful boy, never wanting to hurt people or scare them. This endeared him to certain girls at school, though he quickly deflected any feelings of infatuation by proving to be hopelessly shy and tongue-tied around them. With no friends and no romantic interests, Brad was often left eating lunch alone. At home, though, he always had Greg. Greg had always been the closest thing Brad had to a friend. They did their chores together, fished the streams, and explored the woods around the property. The closest neighbor was 4 miles in either direction, so the two had always found themselves playing together. Greg had been glued to Brad's hip for almost 11 years now, and Brad had always been thankful for the friend that he had found in his worshipful little brother. At least that was how it had been, up until Brad had messed up, right up until the camping trip. Alright, if you're just joining us, we're reading Towsy Homestead. Book should be coming out in August, so if you like it, give it a look when it comes out. Oh, hi, Gamma. I didn't see your comment there. My bad. Thank you, John. It tends to be kind of a slow boil, so I tend to just kind of let it cook as it will. It's a longie too. Like it's a couple of hundred chapter book, a couple of 100-page book there. I try to stop in between chapters, but as the chapters get longer, I feel you on that one. Like I said, as the chapters get longer, my question answering seems to get a little less frequent. And yeah, feel free to leave them in the comments if you got questions or story recommendations, or anything. If you guys get bored with this one, I can read another one. I've got all my books here. I figured this would be something a little special that we haven't really read in a while. And you guys seem to like Maneater when I put it up a couple of days ago, so. The thumbnails on my stuff are done by AI. I use Night Cafe, and it does its best, but it's not often up to whatever's cooking around in my head. I can't draw, and I have a lot of trouble finding a stable artist who will do artwork for me. But I do the best I can, I reckon. Sometimes you gotta soldier on, I liked Maneater. Maneater was a lot of fun to write, and it's a lot of fun to read too. I can't wait to bring that one to you guys and flesh it out a little bit and make something bigger out of it. It's hard to get the whole story in five little stories, so it's always nice when I can take my time and just let a story cook it on its own, A lot of people say that, yeah. Like, a lot of people were expecting it to be like a ghost or like a monster or something, but no, it's just it's something very normal. Well, not normal, but it's something not altogether uncommon. I don't know if all you guys have read it. It's a big snake living in someone's basement. Like, it's not a booger, it's not a ghost, it's not a cryptid. It's just a big old angry snake that's eating. Like, and I really wanted something like that. Like, I really wanted to, show people that, hey, not every cryptid story has to be about, a Mothman or a Wendigo. Sometimes you get crazy things right here in the real world. A lot of people expected it to be Crystal, like that she was like a werewolf or something. Exactly, Gamma. And I put out so much content, not to toot my own horn, but I put out content on the channel 7 days a week. So, it was Crystal, you are correct. I gotta make thumbnails for all of it. I'm preparing next week's content right now, and it's gonna be a bear. I've got to get all the thumbnails together and get everything put together, because next week's going to be long. I've got an overtime day from work, and I've got an overtime day at work, so I'm working on 6 days a week, 6/12s next week. So Wednesday's really going to be about my only day to rest, and I may do some stuff with then, like video stuff, but I intend to have most of it done. I intend to have most of it done Monday, so that I can just post it up and kind of set it and forget it. I thought it might be a mantis lady. That one would have been cool too. Kind of a Lady Dragora thing from the old story where he meets the dragon lady. Yeah, that would be an interesting one to do as well. But I don't know. If any of you guys have ever read Stephen King's old compilation stories, so many of them in there are things he turned into books. Monsters he used, or things like that. And I like to do the same thing. Sometimes a lot of my short stories turn into books. And you'll love to see it. Either that, or I like crossovers too. I like to do like I did with the stuff, the Kashmir stuff. When I put all of them together, I had Grandpa and Dr. Winters and the Warden and the Botanical Gardens, and they all showed up at once, and it was like my Avengers moment there. Everybody was assembled, and we had a lot of fun with that one. Yeah, the Bachman books. It, the character It from It was actually in one of his short stories too. I didn't realize it till I reread it. There's a story about a kid that I'm pretty sure became, what is it called? Desperado? Yeah, Desperation or Desperado. The one about the little kid with mental powers that makes things. But yeah, so many of his books, short stories, became books. I hear that, man. It seems like you've almost got to update 7 days a week though to stay on the algorithm's radar. Um, you got to be putting out that content. The algorithm's been loving it this week because I've got these like long 2 to 4 hour videos, and it has really noticed that my input has come in, and it's been rewarding me, but it's slow to reward most of the time. Anywho, I reckon we'll get back to the story. Let's see. Chapter 2. Got everything packed? Greg rolled his eyes as he put a pair of socks into his camp bag. I guess if I don't, I'll just walk back to the house. Brad waggled a finger at him. No, sir. If you forget it, it's lost till we get back. We're roughing it in the wilderness for the night. No coming back to civilization until tomorrow morning. And if a bear wanders in or a coyote pack? Brad sucked his teeth as he thought about it. Brad sucked his teeth as though thinking, well, yeah, I guess we'd run for it then. Greg hefted his pack and punched his brother playfully in the arm. Didn't think about that one, did you, bookworm? Brad only shrugged. Well, Possum, we can't all just play dead and get out of a bad situation. The two of them jostled each other as they came up the hallway. Brad couldn't help but notice that Greg's bag, the army surplus one Brad had gotten him for his 8th birthday, was considerably lighter than his. Knowing Greg, he had probably just packed a change of clothes, a sleeping blanket, a pillow, and his knife. On the other hand, Brad suddenly felt he might have overpacked. The backpack, something Daddy had carried into the war, was comfortable after years of camping with it, and Brad had stuffed it to the limit with a lot of stuff he didn't strictly need. Aside from his camping gear and sleeping bag, there was also a first aid kit, a tool bag, a latrine shovel, some packed food items in case the fish weren't biting, and an old copy of Lord of the Rings. That, mixed with the tent, made for quite a load. Brad adjusted the pack to cut down on the biting, and his shoulders sighed as some pressure was removed. Better to have it and not need it than to need it and not have it, he thought. The two walked into the living room, Greg groaning as he saw Tom sitting on the couch waiting for them. Tom had assembled an old school bag of Greg's with a small assortment of things from his playroom. Brad could see a small toolbox, a plastic fishing pole with no hook, and the corner of a pillow poking out of the half-shut zipper. Brad could bet there were snacks, along with a garden trowel Mama had gotten him last summer, and the rope he used to play mountain climber. Tom's heart was in the right place, but his gear was woefully inadequate for where they were going. I told you, Squirt, you're too little to go overnight with Brad and me, Greg said, not unkindly. Tom was 4, and he desperately wanted to join his older brother's games. They both knew that by next year he'd be exploring the woods and roaming the fields with them, but for now he was still too little to be camping overnight with the 2 older boys. Mama hadn't even let Greg camp in the woods till he was 8, and Tom might not even get to help in the fields till he was 6. Mama loved all her boys equally, but Brad and Greg had both noticed how protective she was of her youngest. Now he was standing in the living room, dressed more for playing in puddles than hiking in the woods. Oh, hold on a second. My wife. Okay. Now he was standing in the living room, dressed more for playing in puddles than hiking in the woods. Tom had thrown on a thick winter sweater, his ratty old shorts that Mom let him swim in, and a pair of thick rubber boots. He had topped it off with a wide straw hat that Daddy had laughed at when Mama had given it to him for Christmas, and he tried to look fierce from beneath it. Tom looked at them fiercely, his eyes seemingly on the verge of tears, as the 2 boys tried to figure out how best to disentangle themselves without hurting his feelings. Luckily, Mama solved the problem for him. "Thomas, you're not going into the woods with your brothers, are you?" Mama came to stand in the doorway to the kitchen, a bowl in her hand as she mixed up something with the brutal-looking whisk she favored. Thomas looked at her, his mouth working like a landed fish. "But, Mama, I want to go with them," he said pleadingly. "Oh, well, I guess there'll be no one here to help me eat this cake I'm making, and who will lick the spoon when I'm done if you aren't here?" Tom's eyes got big, and he took a step towards her. Brad and Greg saw this as their chance and started creeping around his back as they made their way to the door. Tom was like a dangerous predator, easily distracted, but not for long. He was mulling over the options before him, giving it a lot of thought, and the two boys thought they had made it out when he turned back and noticed them by the door. Tom turned to his mother with a look of deepest mistrust spread across his childish face. "What kind of cake is it?" he asked, crossing his arms, still round with baby fat. "Chocolate," Mama said, making it sound like it was something exotic. "Chocolate," Mama said, making it sound like it was something exotic, lengthening the word as it rolled off her tongue. Thomas left the backpack, and Mama stepped a little to the side as he charged into the kitchen. "Thank you, Sue. I really appreciate that." "You two better hurry. That's only going to keep him for occupied for so long." Brad and Greg made their retreat, Mama telling them to be careful as they left. They were on the porch then, both boys looking out at the lush sea of corn that stood before them. It was almost ready. It was almost ready for picking. The silky tops dancing. God, I swear. Sorry, guys. Somebody's setting off fireworks out there, and it's super loud and distracting. It's the 6th, for God's sake. Like, Jesus. Okay. Don't they know I'm trying to live stream in here? Let's see. It was almost ready for picking, the silky tops dancing in the wind as they ripened in the sun. The Midwestern wind rustled the fields, the cornstalks bending a little as the wind brushed them playfully, and the two boys couldn't help but marvel at the rustling behemoth of agriculture. They couldn't help but take small pride in it either. They had helped their father achieve this bounty, and they knew this was something they should feel good about. So many other farms used farmhands bringing in their crops, cutting into their profits. But Daddy had always been very clear on this being their land and their responsibility. They worked the land, reaped the reward, and next year they would do it again. This was their existence. "Well, look at these two layabouts," came a voice from beside the porch. The boys turned, nearly in unison, to see their father leaning on a hoe and smiling at them. "I give my two best farmhands the day off, and they spend it sleeping in. Sure is a shame." He was trying to chastise and barely coming off his teasing. Craig laughed. "Shoot, Dad, I only get one birthday a year." "Birthdays? Bah, humbug. I suppose you'll want Christmas off, too, while you're at it. And what's your excuse, huh?" he said, turning to smile at Brad. "Well, camping's no fun by yourself," Brad stammered, always unsure how to take his father's teasing. Dale Towsey, proprietor of the farm and patriarch of the two boys, opened his mouth to say more, but all three of their heads turned as a mournful cry came from inside. Brad and Greg could hear Thomas, looking for them dejectedly, forgetting that they had been in the living room only a few moments before. He called their names like a sad calf, Mama trying to soothe them with very little effort, as Thomas came closer and closer to the front door. That should be effect, not effort. Should probably be effect. Nope, effect, I was right. "You two better head for the woods before you end up with a third for your trip." He disappeared into the corn then, hoe over his shoulder, as Greg turned to push Brad playfully. "Race you!" he crowed, taking off for the woods as Brad tried to find his balance again under the heavy pack. Once his feet were under him, he ran after his little brother, laughing and crowing as the two boys headed for the woods. It was going to be a great camping trip. Brad just knew it. All right. Takes us to chapter 3. I'm in... Oh, man, I hope Black Sight's Monday. It's going to be a good one. Yay! I do like super chats. Anybody got anything before I move on? I will gladly answer some questions if you've got any. All right, then, back to it. Brad felt his eyes slipping shut as the cane pole bobbed and creaked. As the cane pole bobbed and the creek flowed. Today had been a great day, and as the afternoon trickled by, much like the water he dipped his toes into, he sighed contentedly as his eyes tried to slip shut. The two had pulled brim from the creek for about an hour. The worms had been unearthed where... I wish they'd run out of fireworks already, jeez. The worms they had unearthed were like candy to the hungry fish, but Greg had gotten bored early and declared that he was going swimming. He had shucked his clothes off right then and there, naked as the day he was born, and climbed loudly into the deep stream. No sooner had he got ankle deep, though, than Brad had insisted that he move down a bit. You'll scare the fish away if you swim so close. If you're going to stir up the water, you might as well scare some fish this way. Greg had moved down a bit, contenting himself with jumping off a rock that sat in the center of the creek. He must have scared some fish Brad's way, because he pulled up two of the largest brim he had ever seen, once Greg started flopping around in the water. Brad leaned back against a stump and let the cares of the world pass him by as he soaked in the feeling of something he enjoyed. He thought back momentarily to what had happened earlier while Greg was chopping wood, but he squashed the idea before it could take root. This may have been Greg's birthday camping trip, but Brad meant to enjoy his time in the woods too. The woods were dressed for autumn, the leaves rich oranges and reds, with some stubborn green ones still peeking through. The two of them had taken to the woods like a pair of deer, and Brad felt at home like he always did when he came to the woods. He closed his eyes and breathed in as the two took to the trails, the smell of green places always filling him with a sense of wonder. The woods were no mystery to him. He had explored them for years, but going into them always filled him with a sense of adventure that only they seemed capable of. Brad always tried to avoid new situations. He had always been a bit of a scaredy cat, but the woods had never filled him with anything but a sense of adventure. He had often wished this was something he could carry into his everyday life, but supposed that it gave the tree-lined refuge around his house something special. Let's see, I've gotten some chat here. Let's have a look. That's all right, Gamma. I don't know what Super Chat really is. Well, they had a good one for it Monday, Sue. They had a whole compilation there. Should be able to get them all caught up. I don't know who's winning the polls at this point. Let me check. Let's see here. Oh, dang. Rayford Woods has got it by 8%. I hadn't seen that coming. I figured it'd be a Black Site story for sure. We'll have to get more votes in before tomorrow. See if we can't tip the scales a little bit. The Rayford Woods one is good too. I mean, they're all good. These are these are usually my top 3 on Mondays, so I figured I'd see which one could win out there. But yeah, no, Black Sight's gonna make an interesting book when I put it together too. It's I mean, they always are, but it's gonna be a lot of fun, I think. All right, well, I'll get back to it. The campsite was only about 20 minutes into the woods, and their hike would be far from strenuous. Greg was excited, his mouth constantly running about what they would do tonight once they got everything set up. His boots crunched down onto the newly fallen leaves. The sounds of squirrels storing up for the winter, birds preparing to migrate, and small creatures preparing for an evening were all around them. Brad tuned his brother down to a dull roar, excited about their adventure. The path lay before them, 2 days of camping in nature's bounty, and Brad intended to enjoy it. Unfortunately not. We'll have to get it, though. It's real close, though. It could still win it, I'm sure. Tuned his brother down to a dull roar, excited about the adventure. The path lay before them, 2 days of camping in nature's bounty, and Brad intended to enjoy it. They arrived at the campsite before noon and found it much as it had been the last time they'd been there. Excuse me. The Towsey boys had campsites throughout the woods, depending on how deep in they wanted to go, but this was the one that saw the most use. It was great for short trips, and the light from the house was still visible at night. Lights from the house were still visible at night from around the fire. If an animal decided to wreck their camp, something Brad had never seen happen, but supposed it was possible, the two could easily follow the front porch lights home. The fire pit was still there, filled with leaves and debris, and Brad knew that tonight's fire would be particularly crackly, as all those fallen colors caught fire. This was good because Greg would want scary stories after the day's festivities, and a crackling fire was essential for good storytelling. Brad was no big fan of scary stories, as his brother wasn't as big a fan of scary stories as his brother. But he knew that Greg liked them, and he would try not to scream again as Greg laid out his tales of terror. Let's see, do you have any reoccurring characters a lot of the canonical ones are full of them. Like, the one that comes to mind is, I guess, Lucifer Jones from the the Richard T. Seraph stories. He was the target of one of his deals and actually joined the party, I suppose. There's a lot of them in the Grandpa stories, in the Dr. Winters stories. A lot of them, like, they start out as just nameless characters and they kind of take on a life of their own. It's always funny when that happens. You never know who's going to be a fan favorite sometimes. Let's see. Greg wanted to head to the creek immediately, but Brad caught him by the sleeve and suggested they might want to set a campfire up while they were still fresh. Greg grumbled, but in the end he agreed to go chop some wood while Brad set up the tent. He took to the woods, axe in hand, as Brad slid the well-used tent from the canvas bag. He knew it would smell like wet canvas, even when dry, but it would keep them snug and warm, even in the worst storm. Their last camping trip had seen them hunkered inside and watching a torrential downpour, the two of them dry and happy. Brad laid out the poles as his brother's footsteps disappeared into the woods. The two-man tent was old, something his father had passed down to him with the backpack, and the two were as familiar to Brad as the ground he sat it on. The pegs were wooden, unlike the new metal ones, but they were thick, sturdy, and unblemished by rot or mold. They came together with practiced ease, but Brad felt distracted as he slipped them into place. He couldn't help but feel something tickling at the back of his neck. He had turned around to look behind him more than a few times, feeling something looking at him as he raised the canvas. As the tent poles went up, Brad felt suddenly suddenly moved to zip the tent closed. Whatever was watching him was making him want to turn tail and run, and it was all he could do not to light out for the farm again. As he reached for the zipper, he heard the voice, though. A sudden gust of wind pushed the tall trees that surrounded them, and the clearing was filled with the sounds of creaking wood and rustling leaves. It stirred the leaves in the fire pit, making a dust devil and swirling it capriciously before Brad's eyes. He shivered as that wind touched him, the feeling reminding him of the winter nights beneath his comforter and the cold walks to the bus stop as he shivered in his winter coat. The wind was nearly arctic, and it foretold the approach of winter. As it gusted into the tent, puffing it out and flapping the canvas, it pulled the pegs from the ground and threatened to take the tent with it. Brad heard the voice even as he smelled the rotten stench of winter rain. Green Man. Brad had been left staring into the forest, the tent's roof straining against the posts before collapsing around him. He had fixed everything by the time Greg had come back with firewood, and when Greg had asked him what was wrong, Brad said it was nothing and suggested they go fishing. That sounded pretty good to Greg, and the two grabbed their poles and headed for the creek. Let's see what we've got in chat here. Let's see. Oh, it's okay, David. You stuck around for a long time, man. I hope you have a good night. Got farm and animal things to do. Oh, I understand. Alrighty, let's see. Let's get back to it. Okay. Brad shivered a little as he lay beside the water, the memory of that strange wind and that stranger voice chilling him. He had all but pushed it out of his mind, pretending it was something he had made up, but thinking back on it now, he realized it had been no daydream. Was it safe to stay in the woods tonight? Of course, Brad thought. The woods were their sanctuary, their refuge from the encroaching idea of growing up. He had never felt unsafe in the woods, not until today at least. Not until today at least. And he wouldn't let a strange something ruin that for him. Cannonball! Brad opened a sleepy eye, seeing Greg jump from the rock near the far bank. He put a hand up to block the splash as his overalls were saturated by the small swell. Greg came up laughing from the depths, and Brad's bobber jounced in the water. Brad shook his arms, spraying water as he gave Greg a deeply perturbed look. His brother laughed as he floated in the cold creek water. The creek was deep for August and cold with snowmelt from the nearby mountainside. Brad would never understand how his brother could swim in such cold water, but he'd seen his brother swimming in the creek in December with snow on the ground, so he knew his skin was pretty thick. "I'm trying to catch dinner, Possum," Brad said, the nickname he'd given his brother sounding like it did when Mama used it. Greg rolled his eyes and pointed to the string of fish hanging from the tree. "What are those 6 fish, then? Appetizers? Better safe than sorry, right?" "Come on," Greg enticed. "It's probably the last swim you'll get till next summer." Brad thought about it, but ultimately shook his head. It was warm today. He'd taken his shirt off and let the overalls he wore sit against his bare skin, but it wasn't quite that warm. Brad had been dibbling his toes in the water as he sat fishing, and the slight taste had been cold enough for him. "Nah, looks too cold. I'll just sit here," and Brad's eyes had been slipping closed again as he leaned back against the stump, but Greg's splash brought him up from the bank in a cold shudder. The water had taken him full in the face, and Brad sputtered loudly as Greg laughed and floated. Brad growled a little, now cold and wet, but Greg dipped his mouth below the surface, looking like a river monster as he watched his prey. "Damn it, Greg," Brad cussed, shaking himself as his brother looked on incredulously. "Ooh, said a bad word." Greg's shrill voice was almost sing-song as he laughed at his brother. "Yeah, and I meant it, too." "Come on," Greg persisted. "You're already wet now. Just come swimming for a little bit. It won't be so cold once you get in. Brad started to tell his brother where he could stick all of that, but relented as he unhooked his overalls. Fine then, you want a splash fight? Brad asked, letting his overalls puddle on the creek bank before bounding into the water, showing his younger brother his own cold splash as he leaped in. You got it. The two boys passed an hour engaged in an epic splash fight. The fish likely wondered at the four pale columns that disturbed their nearly peaceful world, the brothers laughing and snorting as they tussled in the low depths. Their smiles belied the fierceness of the battle. Brad tossed his brother like a cannonball into the further depths of the creek, careful to miss the rocks they knew about. There were some pretty big ones, and he didn't want their fun to end with a hurt back or a broken leg. By the end of it, both their clothes were soaked, their fishing stuff was strewn about the bank, and one of the fish they had caught had fallen from the cluster and was leaving a trail of blood from his split mouth as he tried to hop back into the water before he suffocated. After they expended their energy, the two floated placidly in the creek, looking up at the sky as they enjoyed nature's beauty. You know, Greg said, when I came back from getting the wood, you looked like you wanted to put it all up and go home. Brad's shudder had nothing to do with the cold water. Well, I kind of had something happen while I was setting up the tent. It scared me a little bit. Was it a voice? Greg seemed to think about it before he said it. Brad turned his head to look at Greg and was surprised to see how scared his little brother looked. Greg, though younger, was definitely the braver of the two. He liked scary things. He had even bought some of those pulp comics from the store that made Brad shudder. It was a good thing Mama hadn't found them, or she would have had a fit. She didn't think things like that were appropriate for growing boys. But Greg hardly needed them. He made better, scarier stories than anything in those glossy pages. Nothing seemed to scare Greg. Not the bullies at school that he often got sent home for fighting, not the girls that sometimes came to talk to him, and certainly not anything that might scare his older, bigger, and generally more timid brother. The way he said voice, though, made Brad feel like Greg had been afraid of it too. Yeah, it was a voice from the wind. Did you hear it too? Greg's nod sent up ripples from the water. When I was cutting wood, I kept feeling like something was watching me, something big. I remembered what Daddy always said about some critter not wanting to be seen, and just kept on chopping. I turned a couple of times, but nothing was there when I looked. It was like something was touching my neck sometimes, just stroking it with a finger and running away. Brad nodded, understanding what his brother was talking about. Well, all of a sudden, a big wind came up and shook the trees all around me. I had been raising the axe to swing, and it was all I could do to keep my balance as the wind hit me. As I tried to keep my feet, I heard something say 2 words. Just 2 words, nothing scary really, but I had never heard the wind talk like that. What did it say? Brad asked, the water suddenly much too cold. Green man, Greg whispered, as though we were afraid to say the words out loud. As though in response, a sudden gust cut across the creek, making the boys shiver. The wind felt icy. Maybe it's time to get dry, Brad said. We gotta get the fish started anyway if we want to eat them before midnight. Unless you're too scared to stay out here all night, he added, almost hopefully. Greg splashed water at him and snorted. No way! No noisy breeze is gonna make me leave. Besides, we haven't even told stories yet. Brad chuckled nervously as they got out. He'd been hoping that Greg had forgotten about the stories for once. Of course, they're a tradition after all. I've been working on a really good one, Greg said, shaking off as he grabbed his clothes and slid into his own overalls. I'm sure it'll scare the socks off you. Brad hoped his grin was adequate for masking his trepidation. It looked as though he was in for more than one shiver today. Guys, I'm going to take a little break and be right back, okay? Just a quick fiver. I just need to get some water. Um, I probably will read one more part, maybe two, and then I think that's going to do it for me. Voice is getting a little crunchy. Let me go grab some water and check on the kiddos, and I will be right back. All right, I am back. Got my water. Voice is a little less jacked up. So, let us proceed. Chapter 4. It was a night, much like tonight. The fire crackled as the pine cones and dead leaves were consumed, casting Greg in an eerie light. The August wind was creeping from the east, cold and hungry, as the two boys sat around their campfire, munching their dinner of beans. They didn't have the luxury of a home or a hearth, only having each other in this world. Their parents had cast them out, not having enough money to feed them any longer, and the two boys had been riding the rails, seeking their fortune as they tried to make it day by day. The fish was a little overdone. Brad spit bones into the fire as he came across them, and the warmth of their cook fire was pleasant after the long day of swimming. The two had laid their wet clothes out near the fire, letting them dry as they pulled on a fresh pair and began to cook dinner. Excuse me. As the sun set around them, the tone of the forest changed. The sounds of birds and squirrels were replaced with the sounds of owls and the clitter of bats as they hunted their dinner, and the soft crunch of night creatures who were just starting to go about their business. The fire they had been kindling kept many of them away, the night an unwelcome intruder to their forest. The light an unwelcome intruder to their forest. The two boys were glad for it, though neither would have admitted it to the other. Unwelcome dinner guests were, by their nature, less than welcome. The two boys had managed to beg enough for a can of beans, and as they sat around the fire, they listened to the bubbles. They listened to them bubbling inside as their stomachs growled and their mouths watered. They hadn't eaten in 3 days, you see, and the smell of the beans was enough to make them ravenous. They sat closer to the fire, basking in the smell of the cooking beans, and that's when they heard the cry. Brad cut his eyes to the side, the fishbone ghostly on his lip as he prepared to spit. He had heard something, the snap of a twig, the crunch of leaves perhaps. The bone dribbled to the ground as Brad looked fearfully into the dark surrounding them. He had hoped that after some time spent by the creek, he would be allowed to return to the campsite and have a pleasant evening of cooking, lounging, and listening to his brother weave tales of horror. However, since they returned, Brad had felt watched by something that lingered on the edge of the campsite. If any of you guys are just joining us, we're reading Towsey Homestead. We're about halfway through chapter 1, or through part 1, so, pull up a chair, have a listen. The two huddled close to the fire, the howling gliding between the trees. Their campfire wavered under the torrent of wind, and they hunkered close as they tried to keep it alive. They blocked it from the wind with their bodies, feeling the icy bite of it as they tried to cook their dinner. The howling growled across their shivering skin, and the two boys wondered if this would be their last meal. Brad tried to put it out of his mind. He was just being jumpy. The woods had always been a place of respite for the two of them. Why was he so sure that something was out there trying to get them? He took another bite of fish, sorting the bones out as Greg continued to tell his tale. The beans began to boil over the lip of the can, and the older boy's threadbare glove allowed him to slide it from the flames. A stick snapped out in the woods, and Brad looked up like a frightened deer. Something was out there, watching them, and Brad wished he had brought his rifle with him. It would do little if a curious bear had wandered in, after the smell of fish, but it would put aside a cougar or a coyote. Brad found himself wondering if it was something that walked on 4 legs or 2, though. The woods were a great place for some murderer to happen upon a pair of boys and quietly do away with them. He poured the beans into a tin cup for his brother, gritting his teeth as the heat became too hot for his gloved hand. Daddy might never find their bodies, depending on how far the murderer took them into the woods. As he poured, he could feel something stalking behind him. It had smelled their food and had come to have a look. If they were lucky, it was a small cat or a mangy dog, and it would leave them if they shouted at it. If not, the older boy would stand against it while his brother ran. Either way, the two would eat a few mouthfuls of beans before they died. They might lay forever in the woods they had loved so much. He wrapped his scarf around the can gingerly, holding it by the tatty garment as he tipped the scalding beans into his mouth. They burned his tongue and blistered his throat, but his hunger was too great to wait. His brother moaned in pain as he did the same, the two of them feeding their bodies as they took nourishment. Brad's eyes were slitted as he scanned the tree line, trying to see where the noise was coming from. And all the while, the beast howled and stalked behind them, neither boy looking into the dark woods. They knew that something was there, that something wanted them, but they thought that if they ignored it, it might pass them by. Brad Greg was too engrossed in his own story to feel that the monster he was talking about was stalking the two boys as he spoke. Brad slitted his eyes, trying to see it, and found that he could barely make out a large shape as it stalked the pair. At first, he had thought it might indeed be a cougar, his eyes seeing sleek fur and hearing the impatient click of claws as it stalked restlessly. Then, as the fire caught a thick knot and crackled, Brad thought it might be even larger than that. He felt a shiver roll up his spine as he thought of a bear suddenly lunging up from the darkness to draw Greg into the blackness. The crunch of leaves heralded the creature's approach. The boys still hunkered over their dinner as they tried to ignore it. It had been brought on by the smell of the beans, the smell of food, and it would leave once it realized that they had eaten it all. The two ate forehead to forehead, shivering in the cold as they waited for it to pass. Brad's eyes went wide as he saw the creature stand up on its hind legs, its head suddenly amidst the trees as it looked down at the two boys by their campfire. What was it? What in God's name was it? As it moved around them, the oldest boy could see that it was a large dog. It capered about on all fours, its teeth bone white as it grinned at them. It stalked their little fire, circling the pair 3 times before stopping. It stood between the two, its arrow-shaped head pushing in close, and when it spoke, the younger of the two began to cry in terror. Greg's voice deepened as he voiced the creature, Brad's mind still on the lantern-sized eyes in the tree behind him. You come into my woods and bring your destructive fire, and then you don't even offer me a proper gift. What rude children you are. You will be punished for your insolence. Greg saw Brad's look of terror and grinned, thinking his story was the cause. The boys begged the creature, saying they had nothing to give. The creature scoffed and said they should have thought of that before they came to the woods. The two begged him for mercy, but the creature only laughed and told them that mercy was not a trait it had ever learned. He told them they could either present him with a gift or suffer his punishment. His elegant voice and refined speech at odds with his monstrous demands. The boys had still not summoned up the courage to look at him, and now they shuddered against each other as they thought of what to do. The forest had become absolutely silent. Brad wasn't even sure he could still hear the fire crackling. The birds had gone quiet. The night creatures had left the vicinity of their campsite. It was only the two of them and this creature that loomed in the trees. Brad felt his teeth chattering, his eyes glued to this monstrous thing. He no longer wondered if he could outrun it. Something so tall would mock his attempts to get away before trampling him like a runaway horse. It hadn't moved since Greg started talking about the monster in his story. Was it possible that it was listening? The oldest looked at the still warm can in his hand and saw that he had 2, maybe 3 bites of beans left. He held them out to the creature, still not looking at it, and a weight slid into the can. It slurped at it with its long tongue as it lapped at the beans, smacking as it tasted the juices and liking what it found. The eyes seemed to cock in their unknown head, taking in the story as it unfurled like a black flag. Lovely, the creature said, turning its head towards the younger, who had begun to shake. And you? Share what is in your cup, little one, and you might be allowed to move. You might be allowed to live through the night. The youngest had his hand over the mouth of the cup, unwilling to move it. His brother told him to give the creature a taste so they could leave this place and never return. His shaking hand slid away from the cup's opening, and his older brother felt his stomach drop. Greg paused for dramatic effect, unaware of the play that was happening behind him. The younger had wolfed his beans, eating them all, and had nothing to show but a cup of juice residue. I think we can just shorten that to a cup of juice. The older could see his tears cutting lines down his dirty face, leaving trails of pink against the skin, and as the creature asked for his due, the younger could do nothing but hold out his shaking, empty cup. The tongue slid in, the metal sounding gloopy as the creature searched for food. As it slid back out, the two heard the creature tutting disappointedly. Greg's monster voice made Brad shudder as it came again. Did the monster in those trees have such a voice as well? "What a shame," it said, and suddenly the warmth of his brother's forehead was gone, and the forest was filled with the sounds of his younger brother's screaming. The older brother curled into a ball, shuddering and weeping as he heard his brother being torn to pieces. He closed his eyes and begged God to make it over, and suddenly, as it had begun, the forest was quiet again. The two large eyes blinked in the heights, and suddenly they were gone. He lay there for quite some time, afraid to move. The absence of those lights made Brad even more nervous than their presence had. He thought about opening his eyes, wanting to ensure that the creature was gone. He cracked a single eyelid when a long, high howl split the air between his ears. Brad jumped as Greg loosed a long, loud howl into the quiet forest. He slipped, nearly falling off his log. As Greg grinned like a ghoul at him from his perch. Brad looked up into the trees, but whatever it had been was gone. Where? How had something so large gone without them noticing? Rangers found their bodies the following spring. The younger had clearly been mauled by a large animal, but the older lay prone beside the remains of the campfire. His arms were wrapped around his legs, his teeth set in a rictus of a scream, and the skin that remained on his face looked like a mask of terror. The rangers say that you can still hear the yowls from that unknown creature on quiet nights. No one knows what it is, but those who go looking for it are usually found in pieces on the forest floor. Brad felt his heart trying to leap out of his chest as the sound crashed against the campsite again. "Knock it off, Greg," he said, feeling close to a heart attack. "Once was enough, okay?" When he glanced back at his brother, though, he could see a ghost of fear on the unsure face of Greg Towsey that he hadn't seen since his brother had stopped needing diapers. I didn't do it that time." Well, guys and gals and everyone in between, I think that's where we're going to call it tonight. My voice is getting extra crispy, and I think that's a pretty good taste there. I hope you guys enjoyed Towsey Homestead. Again, the book will be coming out about August, so you can get your own copy. There's a link in the chat here to my book profile if you'd like to get your own. Should be coming together pretty soon. I'll have everything ready to roll. Anyway, thanks for joining me for my stream. It's been a hoot. I would like to do these more often. Usually about every couple of weeks when I can get a long weekend like this. Anyway, hope you guys are having a good weekend. Dr. Plague, signing off.